You think Frankenstein is just a fictional monster? Think again. What Netflix's upcoming adaptation won't dare show you is that Mary Shelley's horrifying creation was actually inspired by real experiments so grotesque, so ethically twisted that they were eventually banned from ever being performed again. We're talking about scientists who literally brought corpses back to life using electricity, doctors who performed public shows where they made dead bodies dance like puppets, and medical schools that turned human dissection into entertainment. For paying audiences, the truth behind Frankenstein isn't gothic fiction. It's scientific fact. And what these 18th and 19th century mad scientists did to human corpses makes Netflix's most disturbing horror shows look like children's cartoons. Prepare yourself for the real story behind the monster, a tale of grave robbing, illegal experimentation, and the horrific birth of modern medicine that powerful institutions have been trying to bury for over 200 years. 1. Dr. Andrew Ure, the butcher who made corpses. Then let's start with the most shocking truth about Frankenstein's origins. There was a real Dr. Frankenstein, and his name was Andrew Ure. In 1818, the same year Mary Shelley published her novel, this Scottish doctor was performing experiments so horrific that even hardened medical professionals would leave the room vomiting. Picture this: Glasgow University, November 4th, 1818. A freshly executed murderer named Matthew Clydesdale is strapped to a table in front of a paying audience of over 200 spectators. Dr. Ure approaches with a massive electrical device called a galvanic battery. And what happens? Next defies everything you think you know about death. Ure begins sending electrical currents through the corpse's body. First, the dead man's face contorts into what witnesses described as the most horrid grimaces. The facial muscles spasm so violently that spectators in the front row actually scream and run for the exits. But Ure isn't finished. He's just getting started. He moves the electrical probes to different parts of the body. The corpse's arms begin flailing wildly. Its legs start kicking, and its chest heaves up and down as if breathing. For nearly 30 minutes, this dead man appears to come back to life, thrashing and convulsing while hundreds of people watch in absolute terror. But here's the truly insane part. Ure claimed he could have actually brought Clydesdale back to life permanently if he wanted to. He wrote that the experiment was so successful that vitality might, perhaps, have been restored if they had performed a tracheotomy and artificial respiration. Think about that for a second. A doctor in 1818 claiming he could resurrect the dead. The Glasgow Herald reported that several women in the audience fainted, and one man was so traumatized that he died of shock 3 days later. The authorities were so disturbed by the public reaction that they banned any future public demonstrations of galvanic reanimation within city limits. But Ure wasn't done experimenting. He was just getting started on a career of corpse manipulation. That would make him the most feared and revered scientist of his generation. 2. Giovanni Aldini, the showman who sold death as entertainment of Andrew Ure, was the butcher of Galvanism. Then Giovanni Aldini was its P.T. Barnum. This Italian physicist turned corpse reanimation into the greatest show on earth, traveling across Europe with his electrical apparatus and a collection of fresh cadavers, performing for audiences who paid premium prices to watch dead people come back to life. Aldini's most famous performance took place in London on January 17, 1803, using the body of George Foster, a murderer who had been hanged at Newgate Prison just hours earlier. The venue was the Royal College of Surgeons, and tickets were sold like they were for the opera, which, in a twisted way, they were. The show began with Aldini connecting his electrical apparatus to Foster's jaw. The dead man's face immediately began contorting, his jaw working up and down as if trying to speak. The audience gasped as the corpse appeared to be attempting communication from beyond the grave. But Aldini was just warming up. He moved the electrical contacts to Foster's ear and mouth. Suddenly, the dead man's left eye opened and stared directly at the audience. His face twisted into what witnesses described as expressions of the most horrid rage and despair. Several spectators became convinced that Foster was actually returning to consciousness and tried to flee the theater. For his grand finale, Aldini inserted electrical probes into the corpse's rectum. Foster's entire body began convulsing so violently that he sat up on the table, his arms waving frantically as if trying to fight off his own death. The effect was so realistic that the bailiff who had supervised Foster's execution became convinced the man was actually coming back to life and tried to rush the stage to re-kill him. The London Times reported that the demonstration was so dreadful and horrifying that several ladies and one gentleman were carried out in a state of syncope. Victorians speak for they passed out from pure terror. But here's what Netflix won't tell you. Aldini wasn't just putting on a show. He genuinely believed he was on the verge of conquering death itself. His detailed journals, kept secret for over 150 years, reveal his conviction that electrical stimulation could permanently restore life to the recently deceased. The most disturbing part? He was getting results that science still can't fully explain. 3. The body snatchers. When medical schools became houses of horror, while Aldini and Ure were perfecting their reanimation techniques, they needed one crucial ingredient for their experiments: fresh corpses. And that's where the real horror story begins, because the demand for dead bodies turned medical education into a criminal enterprise that would make modern organized crime syndicates look like amateur hour. In the early 1800s, the only legal source of cadavers for medical schools was executed criminals. But with only a handful of executions per year and dozens of medical schools demanding fresh corpses, a black market emerged that was so profitable and so gruesome that it eventually required military intervention to shut down. Enter the resurrection. Men, professional grave robbers who turned corpse theft into a highly organized business. These weren't desperate amateurs digging up graves with shovels. We're talking about sophisticated criminal networks with inside informants at hospitals, funeral homes, and cemeteries, all working together to supply medical schools with the freshest possible cadavers. The most infamous of these body snatchers were William Burke and William Hare, who operated out of Edinburgh. But here's the truly horrific part. Burke and Hare didn't just rob graves. When the supply of naturally deceased corpses couldn't meet demand, they started creating their own between 1827 and 1828. Burke and Hare murdered at least 16 people, specifically to sell their bodies to Dr. Robert Knox at Edinburgh Medical College. They developed a technique called burking, suffocating victims in a way that left no visible marks on the corpse, ensuring premium prices from anatomists who wanted undamaged specimens. Dr. Knox was paying them the equivalent of $1,000 per body in today's money, no questions asked. Fresh corpses commanded premium prices because they were easier to dissect and showed anatomical features more clearly. The fresher the corpse, the higher the payment, creating a market incentive for murder. But Burke and Hare were just the tip of the iceberg. Police records from the 1820s show that body snatching had become so common that wealthy families were hiring armed guards to watch over fresh graves for weeks after burial. Iron cages called mort safes were installed over graves to prevent theft. Some cemeteries looked more like military fortifications than places of rest. The most disturbing part? Medical schools knew exactly where these bodies were coming from and didn't care. Lecture halls were filled with paying students learning anatomy from murder victims, while professors like Dr. Knox became wealthy from what was essentially an academic murder-for-hire scheme. 4. The anatomy theaters. Where death became public entertainment, you think modern reality TV is exploitative. In the 1800s, human dissection became the ultimate form of public entertainment, with anatomy theaters selling tickets to watch medical. Professors slice open fresh corpses, while audiences cheered and gasped like they were watching gladiator fights. The most famous of these anatomy theaters was run by Dr. Gunther von Hagens. Wait, no, that's the modern guy. The original master of public dissection was Dr. William Hunter in London, whose anatomy theater became the hottest ticket in town for the wealthy and curious. Hunter's shows weren't medical education, they were pure spectacle. He would begin each performance with a dramatic speech about conquering death and understanding the mysteries of life, while assistants wheeled in a fresh corpse on a marble slab. The audience, dressed in their finest clothes as if attending the opera, would lean forward in anticipation as Hunter made his first incision. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Hunter didn't just dissect random corpses. He specialized in pregnant women and executed criminals, advertising these special presentations weeks in advance. His most popular show was the dissection of a woman who had died in childbirth, where he would remove the fetus and demonstrate the miracle of life by showing how close the baby had come to survival. The audience would gasp and applaud as Hunter revealed each organ, explaining its function while blood dripped onto the theater floor. Women would fan themselves and occasionally faint, while men took notes as if they were attending a scientific lecture. But this wasn't science. It was Victorian snuff theater. Hunter's students reported that he seemed to take particular pleasure in the audience's reactions, often prolonging certain parts of the dissection to maximize shock value. He would save the removal of the brain for last, building suspense like a magician preparing his grandest trick. The most infamous incident occurred when Hunter was dissecting the body of a young woman who had been hanged for theft. As he made his initial incision, the corpse suddenly gasped and began breathing. The woman had survived her execution and was still alive when brought to the theater. Instead of stopping to provide medical aid, Hunter continued with the dissection, while the woman was conscious, arguing that this was a unique opportunity to study the transition between life and death. The audience watched in horrified fascination as the woman died slowly on the dissection table, her eyes following Hunter's movements until the moment of her final breath. The incident was covered up by university officials, but word eventually leaked to the press, causing a scandal that led to the eventual regulation of anatomy theaters. 5. The birth of medical ethics. When science went too far by the 1830s, the experiments of Giovanni Aldini and others had pushed the boundaries of human decency so far that even the notoriously permissive medical establishment of the era began demanding regulations. The turning point came with an experiment so horrific that it finally forced the creation of modern medical ethics. Dr. Karl August Weinhold, a German physicist, decided to test whether galvanism could restore life to mammals by performing experiments on recently executed criminals. But Weinhold took the research one step further. He wanted to see if he could create a hybrid creature by combining human and animal parts. In 1836, Weinhold obtained permission to experiment on the body of a beheaded murderer. He connected corpse's spinal cord to the spinal cord of a freshly killed cat, then applied electrical stimulation to both nervous systems simultaneously. According to his notes, which were kept secret for over 100 years, the hybrid creature showed signs of coordinated movement for nearly 10 minutes. Encouraged by this success, Weinhold attempted progressively more grotesque combinations. He grafted dog limbs onto human torsos, connected pig organs to human circulatory systems, and even attempted to create what he called a chimeric consciousness by linking human and animal brain tissue through electrical stimulation. His most infamous experiment involved connecting the severed head of an executed woman to the body of a large dog. Weinhold claimed that electrical stimulation allowed the human head to control the dog's movements for over an hour. during which time the woman's eyes tracked movement and her mouth appeared to form words. The experiment was witnessed by several prominent scientists, including Dr. Johann Spurzheim, who reported that the hybrid creature seemed to possess awareness and even attempted to communicate. Spurzheim's detailed notes described the woman's head showing clear signs of consciousness and apparent distress at her condition. Word of Weinhold's chimeric experiments eventually reached the public through leaked university documents, causing an international scandal. The Catholic Church condemned the experiments as demonic and called for Weinhold's excommunication. Protestant leaders declared the research an abomination before God. Even the notoriously liberal French Academy of Sciences formally denounced the work as beyond the acceptable limits of natural philosophy. The public outrage was so intense that governments across Europe began passing the first laws regulating medical experimentation. The British Parliament passed the Anatomy Act of 1832, which finally provided legal sources of cadavers for medical schools and outlawed grave robbing. Similar legislation followed across Europe and America, but perhaps the most significant outcome was the establishment of medical ethics boards and the principle of informed consent. The horrors of galvanic experimentation had finally taught the medical community that scientific curiosity alone was not sufficient justification for any and all research. The legacy that Netflix doesn't want you to know, so there you have it. The real story behind Frankenstein. Mary Shelley wasn't writing fantasy when she created Victor Frankenstein. She was documenting the scientific horrors of her time, when respected doctors were literally trying to play God with electricity and corpses. These experiments didn't just inspire a novel. They fundamentally changed how we think about the boundaries between life and death, the ethics of scientific research, and the responsibilities that come with medical knowledge. Every medical ethics board, every informed consent form, every regulation that governs human experimentation exists because scientists in the 1800s proved that brilliant minds without moral constraints can create monsters far more terrifying than any fictional creature. The next time you watch Netflix's Frankenstein adaptation, remember that the real monster wasn't the reanimated corpse. It was the unchecked ambition of scientists who believed that the pursuit of knowledge justified any method, no matter how horrific.